All right, welcome back. So this is going to be our last part, and what we're going to finish with and finish talking about is some of the regulation between the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. We're also going to look at um, reflexes, autonomic reflexes, and how these take place and how they're similar, but they're different to what we look at as being a somatic reflex, right? So if we start as just a review of a somatic reflex is coming from the body, right? So maybe a good example is you step on something sharp, or you lean your hand on a hot stove, something along those lines. You have a sensory receptor that we discussed in a previous part whenever we did general sensation. A sensory receptor is going to pick up that sensation, right? Pain, temperature, touch, vibration, pressure, proprioception, whatever, right? And it's going to send that back to the spinal cord, right? And this is a reflex, so we're going to just go to the spinal cord and then back out to the effector. So with that, you have to have a sensory neuron, right? You have a sensory neuron, afferent neuron, go into the dorsal root ganglion, dorsal root, synapse with an interneuron, right? Interneuron. So here we're in this part, interneuron. And we come back out from the ventral horn of gray matter, out the ventral root to the spinal nerve, and then we go out to some effector, right? So we go out via an alpha motor neuron, right? If we're going to muscle, remember that innervates specifically the extrafusal muscle fibers as opposed to the intrafusal fibers that are innervated by the gamma motor neurons. And then from there, we're going out to the effector and you get some effect, right? You step on something sharp and you withdraw your foot and you kind of extend the other leg to help support your weight, or you pull your hand away from the hot stove that you just touched, right? This is a somatic reflex. Now, although it's not, um, it's still subconscious, right? We're not, um, uh, when you lean on a hot stove, you don't have to consciously think, ow, that hurts my hand, I better pull my hand away, and then you choose to pull your hand away, right? It's a reflex, right? So it's subconscious, it's beyond our control. But it's still considered a somatic reflex because we're using somatic neurons, right? Somatic motor neuron, right? Going out to skeletal muscle in particular, right? For our autonomic reflex, we're going to see something similar, right? So you can see a basic comparison between this loop and the somatic loop that we just did, the reflex loop or reflex arc. But in an autonomic reflex, it's coming from some visceral receptor, right? So we have a visceral sensory receptor detecting stretch of smooth muscle or stretch of an organ or something like that. And we have a similar pathway. So we have to have a sensory neuron. We come back through a spinal nerve. We go through the dorsal root ganglion, dorsal root, into the dorsal horn, and then we synapse directly onto a um, motor neuron, right, in the ventral horn, and then we go back out through the ventral root, preganglionic, and then we enter in through our white ramus. We synapse in the sympathetic chain ganglia with a postganglionic. We go out through the gray ramus, back into the spinal nerve, and then out for our postganglionic neuron to the effector, and then you get the effector stimulated to do something, right? Maybe it was stretch of smooth muscle, so then you get contraction of the smooth muscle for the bronchioles or for the stomach or for the intestines or something like that, right? So different reflexes include those that regulate blood pressure, right? Heart rate, digestive motility, the opening and the closing of different sphincters, which are made up of generally of smooth muscles. Right? Some sphincters are made up of skeletal muscle, right, that you can control. But if it's a smooth muscle sphincter, like those in some around the anal region and in the bladder, we have uh, we have sphincters made of smooth muscle that are controlled via these autonomic reflexes that we don't ourselves consciously control, right? And so you can think about when you're watching these or when you're looking at these reflexes, think of what neurotransmitters are being released and what receptors are they binding to, right? So this preganglionic, we know that all preganglionic neurons are going to be releasing acetylcholine, right? So we're going to go out, we're going to release acetylcholine. That acetylcholine is going to bind onto a nicotinic cholinergic receptor, right? So that's the ligand-gated or ionotropic receptor. That is then going to relay the signal onto this postganglionic fiber here. And if this is the sympathetic division, we're going to come out and we're going to release epinephrine, right? And the epinephrine is maybe going to bind to some type of adrenergic receptor like an alpha receptor or a beta receptor. And again, depending on if it's alpha or beta and what type of alpha and beta, you may get some change in gastric motility, slowing down peristalsis, closing a sphincter, opening a sphincter, increasing secretions, whatever it may be. It's going to depend on the specific neurotransmitter. And then similarly, it's going to depend on the receptor that neurotransmitter binds to, right? So as a review here, kind of wrapping up, remember, fight or flight, we're going to have all of these things, increasing heart rate, so things that you would think of during excitement, emergencies, things like that. Exercise, right? So increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased force of the heart contracting, vasoconstriction of blood vessels to increase blood pressure, increased sweat production, decreased food digestion. So we're going to shunt blood away from the GI tract over to the muscles, right? When you think of this, this is our fight or flight response. And there's a kind of a broader control of the fight or flight response. So some of it has to do with our sympathetic division with the release of epinephrine, norepinephrine. You also have the adrenal gland involved and implicated, right? Secreting adrenocorticotropic hormone from the pituitary gland. This is stimulated to be released by corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus that you're talking about in AP2. And then adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates the adrenal cortex to release things like cortisol. This can serve to increase blood pressure. Increase blood glucose levels. You can also have releases of something called aldosterone, which promotes the reabsorption of sodium and water. So you increase blood volume, so you increase blood pressure, right? So all these things are working together to increase our response to some fight or flight type of situation, right? So exercise, excitement, emergency, all those different things, right? You can then contrast that with our parasympathetic division that we've said several times now, slowing things down, right? Some things, so slowing down heart rate, slowing down or decreasing the blood pressure, decreasing the contractility of the heart, increasing digestive activities, right? So increasing the amount of saliva produced, increasing hydrochloric acid, enzyme, other secretions in the stomach, right? All these different things that we can think of with a rest and digest. And again, with this, think of the neurotransmitters that are being released. All parasympathetic neurons, preganglionic and postganglionic, secrete or release acetylcholine. And then again, depending if it's preganglionic versus postganglionic, you're going to bind to a different type of receptor, right? Nicotinic versus muscarinic, right? Nicotinic being what it's on the postganglionic neuron. So the neurotransmitters released from the preganglionic neuron bind to nicotinic receptors on the postganglionic neuron. And then the postganglionic neuron will release neurotransmitters that then bind to muscarinic receptors on some of the effectors in our parasympathetic nervous system. All right. So we'll end here by talking about a clinical correlate, something called Raynaud's syndrome. Right, and you may have heard of Raynaud's. Raynaud's is a condition in which you get a very rapid constriction of blood vessels in the distal extremity, so in your digits, and it turns the digits this kind of white yellowish color. Okay, it looks very strange. Happens to the digits. Sometimes it can happen to the lips, nose, ears, things like that. Right, things that are very superficial. All right. What you have is a very sudden increase in sympathetic activity. Right, so you get constriction of blood vessels as a result of an activation of some of the alpha receptors that are on blood vessels in the distal extremities, right? So when this happens, you get the constriction of these blood vessels that decreases the amount of blood that can reach that region, and so you get this vasoconstriction. Thus, you don't see the kind of pinkish red hue that you associate with the hand that is indicating the presence of blood, right? So this region here in the hand with this kind of pinkish red region, that's normal, right? Normal blood flow, normal color. Obviously, the distal extremities are not normal, right? That's not a normal appearance. And so you get this constriction. This is, it varies in severity between different people. It can cause numbness and pain. And you can treat it by trying to avoid things that bring it on, so that if you know a stimulus or a trigger for a kind of a flare-up of Raynaud's, you can try to avoid that. So this includes things like trying not to be in cold environments for really long. If you smoke, don't stop smoking, which is a good rule of thumb in general. Smoking can cause vasoconstriction of blood vessels. Also, you can help this out by applying a warm compress to the region. This helps to vasodilate some of those blood vessels. You vasodilate, you get the blood return. You can typically have the resolution of these symptoms. So you decrease the paresthesias or the tingliness in the fingers, decrease the pain, things like that, right? So it's a very strange phenomena, but it's essentially a hyperactivation of our sympathetic nervous system, causing vasoconstriction, decreasing the amount of blood flow to the extremities, and then you get this nice kind of whitish yellow appearance to the digits. All right, so we are all finished with this lecture. Go back and watch some of the previous parts if you have any questions, and as always, reach out if you have any questions or concerns, and I'll be happy to help. All right, thanks.